are privileged to have with us today Professor Ananthamurthy to deliver the 40th Foundation Day lecture. Professor Ananthamurthy needs no introduction. He is an eminent writer, scholar and cultural critic. He is the recipient of the Jnanpith Award and the Padma Bhushan. More recently, he was on the shortlist for the International Man Booker Prize. Born in Melige village in Tirthahalli Taluk of Shimoga district in Karnataka in December 1932, he had his early education in traditional Sanskrit school. He obtained his PhD from University of Birmingham, working on politics and fiction. He was a professor of English literature for several years at the Postgraduate Center, University of Mysore, and later became Vice Chancellor of the Mahatma Gandhi University in Kottayam, Kerala. Professor Ananthamurthy was also Chairman of the National Book Trust and President of the Central Sahitya Academy in Delhi. Many guest professorships led him to Europe and the USA. He has written numerous novels, short stories, collections of poetry, and socio-political critiques. He became a very important cultural figure through his fictional works, and mention must be made of his very important novels Samskara, Bharatipura and Avasthe. His first novel Samskara and the short story Ghatasraddha were made into films and won the President's Swarna Kamal for Karnataka. He has shaped the consciousness of generations of people within Karnataka and India through his writings. Professor Ananthamurthy was one of the most prominent writers that spearheaded the Navya or the modernist movement in Kannada literature, along with the towering figure of Gopal Krishna Adiga. This was done through the setting up of an influential quarterly journal, Rujuvatu, which is one of the most respected literary journals of the time. Rujuvatu provided an outlet for many a young writer to express themselves in various genres and get noticed by a wide spectrum of intellectuals. Professor Ananthamurthy is active not only in literary circles, but is known to articulate his political leanings clearly. He is widely known as conscience keeper of Kannada, the language, the culture and its politics. His leanings were and continue to be with the socialist movement, deeply influenced by Ram Manohar Lohia and nearer home Gopal Gowda. However, Professor Ananthamurthy is not known to be ideological fundamentalist, constantly reviewing his position, re-articulating the discourse as he drew not only from the classical Sanskrit texts but also from modern thinkers, particularly Gandhi and Ambedkar. He has always been vocal and never shied away from taking a stand, even if it meant inviting controversy. In his latest work, Swaragi, a book that recounts his literary and personal journey, Professor Ananthamurthy has provided much of the explanations for how he has evolved as a person and provides justification for all his intellectual stands. We are indeed very fortunate to have such an eminent personality for today's Foundation Day celebrations. Today, Professor Ananthamurthy will talk about challenge of our times from a writer's perspective. I have great pleasure in inviting Professor Ananthamurthy to deliver the 40th Foundation Day lecture.
Dear distinguished people on the dais, and a hall full of people who have come to listen to me and who also frighten me a little. I have been introduced with such warmth by your director, and I must say that one of the teachers here, Sri Ram, is very dear to me as a Kannada writer, and I said something silly about Indian Institute of Management when it came to politics, and he rebuked me in one of the articles, and I have accepted his rebuke because I corrected myself. Because, we think of institutions in a very essentialist way and then make comments sometimes. And then when you look at it closely, then you know that you are wrong and you have to set it right. I'm always prepared to set it right. And today I have taken a very important topic for me, and I have talked about it on several occasions. But every occasion I have talked about it, I have changed it a little. There are so many variations of what I have spoken. I am going to speak about what I call three hungers of our times. I call them hungers. I have used that word from a great French philosopher. I call them hunger because the first hunger is hunger for equality. For nearly 100 years, if you say that what has moved the most spiritual of people, not political, spiritual, it is hunger for equality. Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, the South African president who is ailing, or the Burma leader, take anyone. It is hunger for equality. And if you ask me, which is the most moving prayer in the world, we shall overcome. It's a very moving. Even today, if I hear that, my eyes are full of tears. Not when you do bhajan. I am not moved, but I am moved by this. Because I think the most spiritual aspiration of man has been the aspiration for equality. What was the great concern in the past, which was also a great concern, in the Vedic times, for instance, arhata. Everywhere you talk about who is arha, who is the fit to get this education, arhata. Sometimes it degenerates into only a Brahmin can get this education. It's a degeneration of the concept of arhata. It should not have been better. You also have a arhata test. You don't have caste criteria, and sometimes you are also accused of caste criteria, by democratic institutions, that you take only the elitist. But there has always been a concern with arhata in the past, and also in the globalizing present. Arhata, who is fit to do this. That has produced great systems, arhata. And it has also been not a fixed idea, it goes on changing. You are also challenged to change your concept of arhata. Why? Because the great passion is for equality in the world. It moves the blacks, the homosexuals, the odd people, everyone, the desire for equality. And what is the other? I am going to expand all these. I may even come back to these. That's why I am standing, because I remember I am a teacher if I stand. So I can do that. And if you have made a record of it, I can write it and then give it to you later on as a kind of an essay for you. What is the second great hunger? I call it the hunger for modernity. All old traditions, the young in these old traditions are attracted by what I call modernity. Modernity is different from modern world system. I am not speaking of modern world system. I am speaking of modernity as a state of mind. Who was the first one to be attracted to modernity in India? Gandhi. He wanted to go abroad. And there was a rule that you can't go abroad. He gave an undertaking that he will not eat meat, that he will not do certain things to his mother, and he wrote it down and went and kept a diary that whether he has done it or not, and then produced it. Even then, his community put him out. But modernity was a passion. It was a passion for Gokhale. It was a passion for the great Bengali Renaissance figures. So along with the passion for modernity came a passion for English language. It came along with that because that was an instrument through which modernity could be achieved. But when English is used for superstition, it is no longer by the godmen. There are quite a few godmen who use English for spreading superstition. It is a different use. But the first use was Raja Raman Roy and others who could prove that they wrote English as well as an Englishman. Here is an instance which I used as a teacher. There is a passage that Raja Raman Roy wrote to the governor of Bengal. Once he was coming on a horse-driven cart with a driver, and there was some European English young man standing on the gate, near the gate of a house, and the cart driver did not salute him. And so he got angry, came and pulled the cart, pulled down the driver and hit him and went away. Raja Raman Roy wrote a letter to the governor. I always use this letter because this letter is in a kind of English which Goldsmith used. Long sentences. A page would have one sentence. And then you had to read it so carefully. You should know what is the noun clause, what is the adjectival clause, what is the adverbial clause, where it ends, where it takes. That was an English which my father also admired. It was like Sanskrit, almost. A long sentence like Banas Kadambari. So he writes a letter like that so that the governor will have to read it twice before he understood it. So in a way, like later on the West Indians did, they played cricket better than the Englishmen. Here we played the English language better than an Englishman. So we used English, to show them, we can do it better. But before that, Raja Raman Roy used Persian, for his communications. So modernity was the second largest passion, and a lot of English literature was read by great writers. As a matter of fact, English literature was not read very widely in England, and the British realized if they sent somebody to rule India, Indians are so culture bound that if they didn't know their literature, they would not respect them. And hence English literature was taught in colleges. The first syllabus for English literature came as a result of training people to rule India. Chaucer to Tennyson. So they had to know, so that an Indian would admire them. Here we have a postmaster, but he's a well-read man. Well-read man means he knows Shakespeare. So that kind of a thing. So literature became a very important thing so that they can govern India. So these are all gifts of modernity. So that is the second hunger. The third hunger, about which I am going to speak at length later on, is a spiritual hunger. In the sense, if you are a Hindu, a devout Hindu, you go to temple, you do all the pujas. And if you are a Muslim, you do all the prayers, and the Christians do all the prayers. But then comes, because of science and technology, a doubt whether God does really exist, whether he took 7 days to create the world. Did he also take rest on Sunday? And did they create Adam first and then Eve? Is that true? For in 19th century, Matthew Arnold said it is not true, but it is symbolic. And later on somebody said if you read them as symbols, you can't read it as a religious text. So there was a big quarrel between those who wanted to take it literally, those who wanted to read it metaphorically. Matthew Arnold said if you read it metaphorically, it will survive. If you read it literally, it will not survive. And hence religions have had a problem. And hence people who have a hunger for God turn to spirituality. Without religion, without a prophet, something, a direct relation between me and God. One of the great examples for that for me was Jiddu Krishnamurti. I used to listen to him. I had differences with him, but I could see here was really an attempt to go beyond religions and establish a certain relationship with whatever is the highest. Now, if you ask me, all these three hungers are connected. Connected with what? Connected with the hunger for equality. Even the religious hunger for spirituality is connected with this, because you don't want a pope, you don't want a priest, you don't want somebody higher than you. You want to have a direct contact. And modernity, why? Because you want to belong to the world of knowledge as an equal. Modernity. So, behind all these three, there is this hunger for equality. And hence, I come back to a very important statement by a French philosopher who have influenced me a great deal. There was a statement in the 19th century: to develop criticism of anything, you have to first criticize religion. If you don't develop a critique of religion, you can't have a original thought. Because those who believe in religion think that all questions are settled once and forever in religion. So if you go to the Vedas or the Quran or the Bible, you will get an answer for every question in the world. And hence, where is the room for original thought? And hence, Marx said, to develop criticism, you have to critique religion. In our century, do you know what? It has changed. To develop new thought, you have to develop critique of technology and science. And technology and science are supposed to solve all problems of the world. When you talk about the earth becoming impossible to live on, then there must be some answer in technology. That's what we believe. That's why we don't mind doing any terrible thing on this earth, because we think that there is technology somewhere in our mind which will correct it. I've seen it with regard to religion also. Quite a few of us young people say, there is no God, etc., boldly, because we know that we have parents or grandparents who believe in religion. They will keep it for us. So you can take. So also, we have such a belief in science, we think that we can do anything and science will correct it. With regard to the human health, human body, our own what we should eat, what we should not eat, in everything, because science and technology are there, we think that there is an answer to all our problems. And hence, to develop any true thought in modern times, you have to develop a critique of development. So in my critique of development, which has become the biggest word for communists, for congressmen, and for Modi also, development, I said, don't use the word development, use the word Sarvodaya, which is better, unto this last. So you have to think of every development in the sense of whether it will help the last man. So that's the only way. But what I mean is, this is the modern world system. Is there an answer to all this? Can we create both equality and excellence? I believe that we can create real excellence only through equality. There is no excellence without equality. There are not enough Nobel Prize winners in India because there are quite a few castes who have not got any education. and hence they have not been able to show what they can do. That's equality is the answer for very big questions of this kind. Can you create merit? You have to create merit in this country. I'll give you an example. Sri Ram was also there. We have all come back from Sagar, Hegodu. K.B. Subbanna, my friend, started a new school there, drama school, 1 year. Quite a few boys and girls who may not be able to do anything else, who come from very poor families and very backward areas, take this because there is some money also. They get their food free. They study for a year. Do you know what has happened in Karnataka? Karnataka has produced perhaps some of the best people for theatre in the whole country with this 1 year course given to Dalits, lower castes, Siddhis, tribal people. Within a year they are transformed and they are not spoilt with other kinds of education because they go through from morning to evening exercises, learning, reading new plays, and they just produced a play this time, Sita Kalyanam, written by a great writer of the 19th century. He produced it in 1901, Sita Kalyanam. He was a Gauda from Mandya. He was a lawyer, Sri Kantesha Gauda. And that play is like a Shakespeare play. It plays with reality and illusion. There is a true Rama, there is a Maya Rama. There is a true Ravana, there is a Maya Ravana. There is a true Sita, Maya Sita. There are two of us in every one of us. Isn't that true? Most of us have two of us, some of us have three of us. Many of us. And this play has wonderfully depicted it. And a young man who was trained in this school from one of the very, very backward castes has produced it. People who saw it said, it's a world-class theatre. How did we do it? What was the criteria? We did not do the Arhata test as you do for business schools. Anyone with an SLC was Arha for it. And unless India opens out like this, it can't create equality in the country. And once you create it, there will be many talents. India will be, if you go to America, I have taught in America, there will be a separate section for Nobel Prize winners to park their cars. There will be so many Nobel Prize winners. That may happen in India too. But we are not getting the best out of our population. There are school dropouts and so many problems, they are dropouts. And these 2 or 3 days, I will give you my immediate experience of equality. I was put in this committee to find out how many people deserve Rajyotsava Prashasti. There are 50 of them. We looked at all the, we should not ask them to apply. We should have them nominated. It's a wrong thing, sir. You are also there, in the government, so you should be able to say this. Somebody should nominate them. Anyhow, I had a very peculiar feeling. For 50, if you want to select them purely on merit, you can select only Brahmins. Only Brahmins, because you will get 50 Brahmins easily. You will get at least 45 Lingaites, or 50. But if you don't do that, and if you think that there should be social justice also, recognition of new knowledge in a new people who have been exposed to these new things in the last 50 years only half a century. Some histories are histories of 1,000 years, it's only half a century. Then you will find in every caste an intelligent man. What produced it? Reservation produced it. Ambedkar produced it. We should never forget that country is growing in the true sense by creating new intelligence in new classes. And particularly, I can tell you this from my own experience, to develop knowledge in mathematics is harder. The more abstract the subject, harder. But when intelligence is much more concrete, intelligence of the body, movement of the body, of the hands, of the speech, of acting, it is there everywhere. There are very intelligent people in their hands, in their eyes, in the way they move, in the way they express their talent, but they fail the SSLC examination because English is compulsory. And they don't pass it. Whereas here, there was no such thing. They passed and they showed that they can be very intelligent. Can you, as an Indian Institute of Management, redefine intelligence? Can you redefine intelligence to include not merely what happens in the so-called cerebral area, but in the whole body of the human being? Can you redefine intelligence? And then you will have more sportsmen, more people who can do better things. That, I think, is a challenge of our times, to redefine intelligence and look for it and develop it and change the whole criteria of arhata from other points of view also. Not give up arhata, but redefine it by taking scientifically into account certain kinds of intelligence which are already there, but which are not. I was one of the members in the drawing up of what kind of syllabus we should have at the national level, and in the cultural thing, I made a recommendation which was accepted by all the members and also the ministers. When you assess a student at the high school level, his other skills, cultural skills, are considered extracurricular or co-curricular. I said, consider it as curricular. If a boy or a girl is excellent in climbing a tree and jump from one branch to the another at the age of 8 or 10, there must be something extraordinary in that child. It should also be a curricular quality, curricular, not extracurricular. And if you do that, I think the other kinds of skills which are related to this will come later on. I'm not saying that this is the only skill, but there are other skills which are related to this skill. And a boy who can easily steal something. And I had friends, who could just pickpocket so easily that I would never know, and then they would come and bring it back. One of them is a very great man, Dr. Ratna. I have written about him. He could do it and he became very intelligent in other things. So there is a lot of mischief in children which is connected with intelligence, and we should be able to recognize it. That's why I said, these three great hungers, at the root of it is equality. And if you can meet that in terms of arhata, the others will also develop. And this is true of India, this is true of Europe, this is true of every country. And it is fashionable to call people who advocate these things like me as New Agers. I found out from my internet that there is a word for it, New Agers. Gandhi is one of the New Agers. Blake was one of the great New Agers. And a friend of mine who has written a book on New Agers, Martin Green, says that there are three kinds of solutions to all our problems. One is a systemic kind of solution. Most of you believe in system. You have to make a system, and if the system is good, you can change quite a few things by a better system. There is some truth in it. There is no doubt about it. There is some truth in it. System has to change. Karl Marx was also a systemizer. I think management people are also people who believe in systems. You know, a good system makes for a better thing. And I am also a systemizer because I told the chief minister, next time don't make people apply for this. Ask 100 people to nominate each one of them 2 or 3 people. So I'm trying to build a system so there is nothing wrong in system builders, but if you think that building system will change the world, you are wrong. Will make the world as it is work better. It will not change the world. And the other kind of people are people who believe in hegemony. You know, there is the first rule of good governance. If you can govern a country with love, great. If you can't govern a country with love, at least try to govern it with fear. Then you can have some governance. When Indira Gandhi had emergency, the trains began to run regularly. When Modi becomes Prime Minister, if he does, I don't want him to, the trains will run correctly. No doubt about it. So, those who believe in system is one kind. Those who believe in authoritarian rule is another. In India, there is now a real war between system builders and people who believe in authority. Or you think that if you have system plus authority, the country will run very well. Very well, yes. But the 3 hungers I spoke of will not be fulfilled. We would be better human beings. Because I use another word. I want that word to become more popular. You use the word sukha for sukhi rajya, welfare state, happiness. I am a little critical of that word. If there is sukha, there is also dukkha. There is also disappointment. There is something else which is called nemmadi, which is neither sukha nor dukkha, but being at peace with oneself. I think a government should aim at nemmadi, not either sukha or dukkha. Now, if you come to dukkha, I will just read a poem, and that is my last point. A man, a new ager, somebody who thought the way I have been now talking about, because the new agers are sometimes very naive people. Unless you are naive, you won't get a new idea. Very intelligent people who are full of opinion will not get a new idea at all. In order to get a new idea, sometimes you have to become naive. I know nothing. I am empty. I have let God come to me and speak to me. That's what Blake did. He would have a new idea. Lawrence would have a new idea. Yeats would have a new idea. Gandhi would have a new idea. Otherwise, how would you have thought by lifting up a little salt, he can make the whole British Empire tremble? I have a friend who tells me, when did India become free? On the day Gandhi went there, took a handful of salt and held it up like that. British Empire was gone with a handful of salt. Nehru could not think of it. It was Gandhi. And Gandhi was naive. A naivete of Gandhi defeated all the intelligence of the British. How many people could they put in the prison? It was as if there was no British government at all, because there were lawbreakers everywhere. They were lawbreakers, but not violent people. It was brilliant. So naivete is the basis of sometimes new thoughts, silence, prayer, meditation, allowing great things to come into you. Blake used to listen to angels and write the poems. That's what he said. Somebody dictates these poems to me. But Blake was also a poet. He corrected what the angels dictated. So I don't fully believe. So he had to correct them. Anyhow, he was a New Ager, naive. He was so naive and truthful. He believed that we should be naked. And so he was prepared to be naked. And he told his wife, you also be naked. She agreed. But when he wanted the servant woman also to be naked, she said no. He had problems with his wife, because she could not go that far. But Blake was like that. They thought that he was a madman. But if you take the British history and look at that period when they were industrializing, the greatest mind they produced was William Blake. Because he was a very deep critic of industrialization. Now here is a poem I will read you. What Blake wrote on London. What was London like? I wander through each chartered street. Look at the word chartered. Chartered because the government has put a C on each street. Because it's being governed. Chartered. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow. Even the Thames water, the river is also chartered. And mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Everyone is sick. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. It's a great phrase. Mind-forged manacles. Manacles are kaibedi, but they are forged here, in the mind. Mind-forged manacles I hear. Where do they come from? From politics? From economics? From university disciplines? Manacles begin to forge your mind because you have read these things and so you can't change. The mind-forged manacles I hear. This is a great line. The chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. In those days, the chimney sweepers were necessary because you used coal for your energy and the whole, the soot would fill it. And a young boy who is not old, who is thin, had to get down the chimney and clean the soot. And so these chimney sweepers would be black, always black. They would wash once a week. And when they walk the street, like our vegetable vendors, when they walk the street, they call Sautakai, etc. They would call sweep, sweep. But sweep is a difficult word for them to speak. Weep, weep, they would say. And Blake has registered it. Chimney sweepers cry, weep, little boys. To sustain your energy requirement and your new industrialization. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. All the church buildings have a black layer on their body because of this soot. And pall is also a cloth which is put on a dead body. Churches are dead, and there is a black cloth on them. Look at Blake's mind. How religion has failed, how church has failed during industrialization. Was industrialization necessary? Yes, necessary. I'm not saying it was unnecessary. But did it produce woe, hardship, dukkha? Yes, it did. And when we tell the history of development, we try to forget it, sweep it away, and not talk about it. Does the Indian development now harm people? Yes. People who come from the hills, the tribal people, they lose their homes, they lose their land, they lose their ways of living, and they have to come and stand before your house with a staff in hand and a uniform and get 2,000 to 3,000 rupees a month. They are losing their way of life. For what? Development. And then if you ask a development economist, this is inevitable. How else can the country grow? But what happens to people? You know, Blake is asking that question, and I want a room for that kind of a question in those of you who believe in development. Otherwise it becomes inhuman. Every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. The helpless soldier's sigh, because he is the one who sacrifices. There is a red line on the palace walls. But the last stanza is very important. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse the prostitute, blast the newborn infant's tear, because the sexual disease began to appear then. Children were born blind. Syphilis, harlot in the midnight, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. The marriage hearse, which is so sacred, is plagued by this. And this he wrote at the time of 1794, the height of industrial revolution. Not that he stopped anything, but I have always a feeling, even if you can't stop certain evils, a very deep feeling within you, which comes from music, from poetry, from great sources, will help us being human for a longer time. And maybe the cruelty will be a little less if we intervene. Thank you very much for calling me.